when you go on a porn site, a free porn platform, again, why is it free? And with any tech service that's free, you are the product.
My name's Elly Hanson, and I'm the founder of the Naked Truth Project. What happens when you bring 6 leading voices together to talk about pornography? In the PWordTalks, I travel across the country to have honest, eye-opening conversations with experts including Dr. Paula Hall, Helen Taylor, Dr. Alex Bailey, Dr. Elly Hanson, Lord James Bethel, and Dame Rachel D'Souza. They come from different backgrounds: mental health, safeguarding, politics, and public advocacy. And they don't always agree with each other, or with us at Naked Truth on every point. But they do agree on this: porn is causing real harm, and it's time we talked about it. So I'm joined today in a sunny Bristol in the UK by Dr. Elly Hanson. And Elly, it's great to have you here. You're a clinical psychologist, you're a researcher, and also you're the co-founder of Fully Human. So let's start by you just telling us a little bit about what Fully Human is and what the aims are.
Thanks, Ian, and such a delight to be with you today. Yes, so Fully Human is an initiative of the PSHE Association, and it's effectively a think tank that seeks to ask and, as far as we can, answer some of the big questions that are facing our children and young people today, both the harms that they're facing and the cause of those harms, but also, what good looks like. What does it mean for our children and young people to flourish? What would it mean for them to be living a fully human life? We're not saying that we've got the full answers to those questions, but we do think it's really right to be asking them and seeing how far we get.
And so some people watching, listening might not be UK based. So what does even PSHE mean? Just, I'm more aware that maybe people are going, what's that? So what's that even stand for?
Yes, it stands for Personal, Social, Health and Economic Education. And it's really that part of the curriculum, what happens in schools, that is looking at wider life beyond those academic subjects. So it would include relationships and sex education, for example, helping children understand what healthy relationships look like and safe sex, etc.
Yeah. And so why this for you? When you were at school, did you sit down with your careers advisor and say, I want to start doing lots of research about pornography? How did you get into this? Why is it so important for you?
Yes. I love the big question. I've just said that they're important to ask. I think, if we go back that far, I have always had a strong sense of my core values and the value of each of us as humans, the importance of good relationships, self-worth, helping people live their best lives. So that then led me into psychology. A big focus of my work for a very long time has been abuse, particularly sexual abuse. And I've worked with that both therapeutically, supporting survivors, supporting children, and also in the criminal justice system. With all of that, I think something that started to kind of burn within me was wanting to go upstream of the problem. It's absolutely right that we support people on from these harms, but we also need to do our very best to prevent them in the first place. And that means looking at the big picture, looking at society and thinking about what's fueling these problems and what can we do to tackle those, those root causes, taking much more of a systemic perspective. So I've tried to find ways to do that. Education is obviously one of them. But also we do need to have attention on the whole tech ecosystem and regulating that.
And so, you have looked at this very broadly, and we'll dive into some of those things in this conversation. But part of that is, like Naked Truth, you have become sort of publicly critical of pornography and the impact it can have, particularly on young people and children. So I think we've found, and I don't know if you have, that a kind of common response sometimes can be when you start to be critical of pornography, that maybe maybe we're just being prudish, or we're kind of, you know, maybe against sexual liberation, or we're not pro-sex. What would your response to that sort of pushback be?
I mean, a very straightforward pushback. Prudishness suggests a reluctance to talk about sex. I spend a huge part of my working life talking about sex very openly, so this doesn't fit with the prudishness. It actually fits, you know, those of us critical of the porn industry tend to also be very much on the front foot talking about sex and talking about what good sex looks like. That's actually part of what drives us, that passion for good sex and supporting people to have that.
Yeah, I mean, we'll definitely talk about good sex. I mean, I think the sort of pro-porn groups, or even the industry itself, might sort of say that porn actually helps good sex. It helps people explore their sexuality. You've suggested that might be wrong. So why? How come you think it's wrong?
Yeah, and we can answer that through various different avenues. One being, let's just look at the very straightforward research. Does porn correlate with sexual and relational satisfaction? No, it doesn't. It is leading to a decrease in sexual satisfaction. So that's really interesting, isn't it? If porn proclaims itself as being all about sex and, you know, having great sex and being really sexy, why are people becoming less satisfied in their sexual experiences after watching it? And, you know, then we take a step, well, let's answer that question of why. That makes sense once we look at the nature of porn and what type of sex porn is promoting. It is not promoting sex as a whole. It is promoting a specific form of sex that it makes money from. And we really have to follow the money to understand what porn is all about.
We will talk a little bit about that, because I know you've done some research around the kind of the commerce, if you like, of pornography. But before we do, I know you've also conducted research about online misogyny, and I think that would be a significant area of critique around pornography. So what does that online misogyny look like? Help us understand that, and what connections have you seen with online porn?
Yeah, so again, as you say, it's another major focus of mine, and everything connects up. So, for example, last year I was involved in a campaign that was led by Vodafone and the charity Global Action Plan, where we were doing a bit of a dive into online misogyny and what teenage boys were being shown online. And what we found was really startling. We surveyed over 1,000 11 to 14-year-old boys, and we asked them the question, you know, how long are you online before you start seeing certain types of content? And we found that within 10 minutes of being online, likely to be on social media, between a fifth and a third of them were seeing sexual content, violence, content that made them feel bad about themselves, and content that was negative about girls and women. So you can only imagine those percentages are going massively up the longer that they are. So within 10 minutes of going on social media, there's...
In what comes through on the feeds.
Exactly.
So they're not necessarily searching those things, it's just that's what the algorithm is presenting them with.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Without searching for them, they are being bombarded with violence and negative content about girls and women, sexual content and stuff that makes them feel bad about themselves. And let's think a bit about that negative content about girls and women. What does that look like? And this is likely to be an underestimate, because a lot of boys will be seeing content that they don't identify themselves as being negative about girls, but it actually is. So to give you an example, there's a lot of content on their feeds that is pushing the gold digger meme. Now, that's the idea that girls, you know, one has to be kind of inherently suspicious of them and their motives. They are out to kind of use men. So, for example, there'll be a video of a guy that tries to chat up a girl who's disinterested until she discovers that he's got a Lamborghini, and then she's all over him. Now, TikTok couldn't just go, right, we're going to ban that because it's extreme misogyny. By itself, it's not, but it's part of a pattern that is telling boys to hold girls at arm's length and to just be suspicious and concerned about their motives. Then you combine that with porn, because Ian, you were asking about how do the two link, and they do very much go together, because boys are then getting that message that, you kind of want girls for sexual gratification, but they can't really be trusted to actually relate to and to deeply connect with. So, just kind of use them for sex, and you kind of see them as half human, as objects, but you don't want anything else more to do with them. So the messages from misogyny and the messages from porn are really dovetailing and taking us to a really pernicious place where it's undermining the ability of boys and girls to have satisfying relationships with one another.
And have you seen in your research any kind of escalation from that kind of online kind of exposure to misogyny, maybe even violence and abuse towards women and girls, and then offline behaviour?
Absolutely. And I can answer this in a number of ways. Personally, I was, working with young people with harmful sexual behaviour 20 years ago, and who we saw at that point, the children that were behaving in a sexually harmful way typically had quite extensive trauma histories. That picture now seems to have shifted, that those who are presenting with those problems, there doesn't have to have been a trauma history. Porn is pushing them, like you say, alongside the misogyny, over the threshold into that behaviour. And we're then seeing that in the academic research. So you've got a big recent meta-analysis that included, the findings from over 16,000 participants, finding a very clear link between pornography exposure in young people and sexual harassment, harmful sexual behaviour. You've got the longitudinal studies that have mapped children over time. You've got one big study that started when they were 10 and is now up to their early 20s, and finds that exposure to porn at time 1 is predicting sexual harassment and abuse at time 2. Violent porn is having a particular impact, but porn as a whole is. And we can't reassure ourselves and say, oh, well, it's only violent porn, or violent porn is the real problem, because pornography is riven with violence. It's not easy for young people to separate out.
One of the things that perhaps people may remember, depending on when they're watching this or listening to this, is what's almost become a phenomenon around one particular program on Netflix, Adolescents. And that's not just in the UK. I know that's kind of had a lot of traction in other territories as well. I think what has shocked a lot of adults who perhaps not really thought about this topic very much before is oh my goodness, is this really what young boys are being exposed to, and then how is that then linking to what happens in their kind of offline lives? I mean, do you feel there is a crisis in adolescence, and how are you seeing boys and girls experience that differently?
I mean, look, adolescence has never been easy. It is a time marked by insecurity and potentially personal crisis. And we don't want to miss that point. It is a time of rapid brain development, just like the early years. There's no other time like it. Children are changing physically, growing up, but also there's these key developmental tasks around identity and one's peer group. So, who am I? What do people think of me? How do I relate to my gender? What does it mean to be a boy or a girl? And that comes with vulnerability and uncertainty and confusion. And that's rightful. We all need to navigate that, and, we do that and we come out the other side. But what's different now is that you've got the highly sophisticated algorithms trained on adolescent brains, attempting to shape them towards corporate profit. So what is a fragile time of life, marked by vulnerability and often insecurity, you've then got corporate influences, making that land grab, kind of invading that space and twisting it, and that is causing a crisis. You asked, does that look different from girls and boys? Kind of yes and no. The algorithm with both boys and girls is finding and fomenting insecurities, and kind of, it's looking for those things that will keep people on for longer, and that tends to be quite base emotions and impulses. So it might be shock, horror, anger, but it also can be insecurity, also the opposite, feelings of entitlements, feelings of superiority, looking to belong, as well as obviously sexual arousal. So it looks to find those things and then amplify them, and that can just make the problems and issues that teenagers are already grappling with so much bigger. As we've spoken about, boys are being bombarded with this content that's negative about girls and women. Girls are being bombarded with content that is telling them how to be a girl and how to fit within these quite rigid gender norms. So to be honest, both boys and girls are being told how to fit into these gender straitjackets, what it means to be a boy, what it means to be a girl. And we know that those traditional gender norms don't do well for us, that they don't serve us well, and they detract from us feeling secure and enjoying good relationships.
I definitely want to talk about something you've mentioned there in terms of the algorithm, and I know you've done some work around that. But before we do, let's just talk about objectification. And again, I know that's sort of some work you've done. You did an essay called "No More Than the Sum of Her Parts," which I love the title of, by the way, and the play on words that there is there. How sexual objectification diminishes humanity. And what is sexual objectification? Let's start there. How would you define that? And in what ways do you see that dehumanising both men and women?
Objectification is unfortunately a bit of a mouthful, isn't it? It's a jargon term that doesn't feel very accessible, and yet it describes something so important, something that we are all facing today and that is impacting all of us. And we've got a really rich literature here to help us understand it. So simply what I mean by objectification is when we look at somebody and treat them primarily by their physical sexual appeal. So we are less concerned with other parts of who they are, their personhood, their psyche, their emotions. Now, what it is not is important. It is not finding somebody attractive. It is not finding somebody physically attractive. It is when that is put on a pedestal and that is the focus beyond other parts of who they are. Like I said, a huge amount of research looking at what happens when we objectify one another. And if I just sum that up, in a nutshell, it shows when we look at somebody through an objectification lens, we start to see them as having less of a mind, feeling less sensitive to pain, being less moral, being less deserving of moral treatment, being less warm, and being less competent. There's quite a lot of things there where you could take any one of those and it's an easy step to their maltreatment. We can see how if you see somebody as less deserving of moral treatment, for example, there's less reason to treat them with the care and dignity that they deserve. If you see somebody as less competent, you are less likely to put them in positions of responsibility, and on it goes. Then you've got the whole other side of the coin, which is self-objectification. Because objectification is not just how we view others. We can be taught and shaped to see ourselves through this lens. And scarily, the research on that finds a very similar picture, that when we objectify ourselves, when we see ourselves primarily in terms of our physical sexual appeal, we dumb ourselves down. We see ourselves as less agentic, less capable, less warm, less moral. And so therefore that is then a precursor to victimization, to putting up with bad treatment, because that's what we think we deserve, and we don't deserve more than that. and obviously there's a huge gender dynamic here. Objectification tends to be something done towards women and girls, and also when it is done towards women and girls, it has a much bigger impact than when it is done to boys and men. Like that's not just me saying that, that's the research, because it fits into that wider backdrop of sexism, misogyny, and kind of wider sexual objectification.
I think people maybe feel more familiar with the idea of objectifying somebody else. I think it's really interesting you talk about that dehumanizing of a person. Not necessarily, objectification isn't always about attraction. It can actually just be that process of dehumanizing, and I think that's really interesting because you even see that in propaganda in countries in history and present where a whole type of people group is being dehumanized, and then how, as you say, that almost permissions people to treat that group of people in a certain way because they're less human in some sense. But maybe what's less common is this idea of self-objectification. I think people think less about that and how that can create that victim mindset. I'm really interested in that. So do you think that's why there is then a tolerance to sort of verbal and physical violence, whether it's that dehumanization that's happening from someone else or even that victimized sort of self-objectification? And again, just this idea that, there is this violence, verbal or physical violence towards women and girls in pornography. It's a huge part of what pornography is. So, we know that the stats are high. And do you think that's why that's being tolerated and why people are watching that and thinking, this is okay?
I think it's a very big part of it. And, I think if you took that violence and you put it in a different context, you put it in the context of a relationship, so kind of domestic relationship, or you put it in the context of, political prisoners or something, people would be absolutely aghast. And in fact, there was a bit of research, taking the violence from porn and putting it in a different frame and it then being seen as torture. It is just jaw-dropping, the level of violence that we are tolerating and, taking the attitude of nothing to see here, it's just someone's kink, it's just sexual freedom, which we would never tolerate in any other sphere of life. Now, why is that? And I would say, yes, sexual objectification is a huge part of that we're not even realising that we're seeing the people in porn as less than fully human, as less deserving of respect, of dignity, and of care.
You've written in an essay about consent culture. So what is that and why are you critical of it?
Yeah, consent culture in a nutshell is a sexual culture defined by the rule that all you need is consent for good or ethical sex. And yes, as you know, I've written another essay for Fully Human critiquing that idea. Now, I'm not critiquing that we need consent. It's a really important legal rule. I think the law is absolutely right. But let's look at that. Would we ever simply use the law as our basis for how we relate in any other sphere of life? If I'm thinking about what a good friend is to me, I don't think of that as somebody that just doesn't break the law with me. They don't steal from me. They don't assault me. I'm thinking about, do they like me? Do they respect me? Are they generous towards me? Are they honest? All of these other things. We have a rich ethics that effectively consent culture is telling us to switch off in the sexual arena. And again, it's mind-boggling when you think about it. The sexual arena, the arena where we are at our most vulnerable, we are told that none of that matters. All that matters is, kind of getting a yes from one another. And then effectively, I'll use your body while you use mine. And it's that focus on one's personal sexual gratification. And as a result of this myth, you have a huge number of people consenting to sex that they find distressing, that they don't want, that they even feel violated by, but they have no language for that. And again, this is not just me saying it. We've got a lot of research showing, particularly women, grappling to explain distressing sexual experiences that they have no language for because consent culture has deprived them of it.
you've said that mainstream online porn isn't about sex, but actually it's about money. So, yeah, what did you mean by that?
Well, let's start with the core motivation behind porn. Is the core motivation, a sexual one? No, it's a financial one. Porn is there to make money, isn't it? So we really need to think about that core motivation and then how it plays out. Human sexuality, it's diverse. There's there's a huge range of things that humans can be turned on by, that our sexuality can entwine around. I think of it as like, say, vines growing, and what do we grow the vine around? What does that trellis look like? And the porn industry is effectively a particular trellis. We have the potential to develop our sexuality around connection, around chemistry, around mutual pleasure and desire and relationship. And that's where we know the heart of kind of healthy sexuality and more fulfilling sexuality lies, a safer sexuality. But we also have the potential to be turned on by dominance, inequality, violence, objectification, all of these other things. The porn industry can only make money from some of that sexuality. Fundamentally, it cannot make money from relational sexuality. It cannot get between two people who fancy each other, who have that chemistry. And if it somehow does, then that money shifts something fundamental to that dynamic. But traditionally, it therefore ignores that whole realm of human sexuality at best. At worst, it actually ridicules and derides it. And instead, it seeks to find and then ferment the proclivity to be aroused by these other things that are then very conducive to us behaving badly towards one another.
So do you think then that ethical porn is a possibility? It's something that people, are trying to seek and advocate for? Is that something you personally think can be done? Can we have ethical porn?
I think that porn can be improved. I think there's a lot to be done about ridding porn of the, violence that is riven through it, and the, abuse that's riven through it, the manipulation. And that would be a really good step forward. Whether that then takes us into an ethical place is a big question mark. At the moment, we have the situation where people are asking questions about the free porn platforms, and one answer has been the rise of OnlyFans and other webcamming platforms, and that has been narrated as an ethical alternative. I would really challenge that. I would see the webcamming platforms as having as many ethical problems to them as the free porn platforms. They're different ethical problems, but they're just as pernicious.
What are some of those for you?
What OnlyFans and others have done is they have worked very hard to normalise sexual commodification. So the narrative coming out of OnlyFans is that, sex work, in inverted commas, is like anything else, and, all get on the bandwagon and make a lot of money, and it's very empowering for girls and women. What that has then done is it's led to a society where many young women are producing porn on OnlyFans, potentially unaware of the spirals that can then take hold, where they are under pressure to produce more and more extreme content, or for that sex work to move into kind of an in-person format. And essentially, girls are being taught that sex is about their performance, and them selling sex towards males, and boys and men are being taught that sex is something that they buy. And what's very convenient here is that OnlyFans takes a 20% cut. So, in a way, the world, according to OnlyFans, is our sexual experiences with one another go through their platform, and they are taking rent on our sexuality fundamentally. And this is what Yanis Varoufakis, the economist, has termed techno-feudalism, looking at how the big tech platforms we have a new economic model where the main mode of wealth extraction is now rent rather than profit. And our attention, our experiences, human existence itself, these rivers of human experience are funneled down these waterways that run under their mills. That everything we do, they are taking a cut from, and it's really dystopian. And there's more awareness of this happening with social media. There is much less awareness of this happening to our sexuality.
Yes, and I guess that techno-feudalism is this idea that as there was here in the UK, there were some lords who owned all the land and everybody else is renting land, and basically it's a very few people who profit, and I guess that's our tech giants. They're the new lords, and we're all in some way or another dependent on them. But what you're suggesting is that's even now overlapping into our sex lives and our sexuality, and that's another area of control that a tech lord has.
Absolutely, because the term attentional serfs, that we are providing big tech with our attention, that is, and our data, and our creativity, all of these different parts of us, that is the basis of all of their value. And obviously there are certain things that keep us online for longer. So the algorithms are trigger-based, engagement-based is the key term, but it's a bit of a misnomer. And we are engaged by things that maybe are quite primal, what makes us angry or shocked, etc. But it's also what we find arousing. And so sex is used to keep us online for longer. Social media, a huge percentage of it is now porn or sexualized content. And then, if you look at something like OnlyFans, there the model is, that your sexual experiences go through their platform, and they're obviously taking a cut from that.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I feel like a word that people would associate with a platform like OnlyFans or just within pornography and that whole conversation would be freedom. That there's somehow it's empowerment and there's freedom there. I know you've kind of argued that the pornification of society is linked to these ideas of freedom that can be found within, say, neoliberalism. Can you unpack that at all?
Yeah, as you know, I like going to these big societal forces and looking at them and looking at the influence they're having. And just another little plug, I've got an essay coming out again on Fully Human, squarely looking at the narrative of freedom and big tech. Look at Mark Zuckerberg's rhetoric. It's really loaded with liberty, freedom, these big concepts. And yet, is it freedom? I'm really arguing quite the opposite. What you've got across big tech is manipulation. And again, I use that word very carefully. That's a word that has been debated by philosophers and academics. But by any definition of manipulation, the algorithms tick it. They are disinterested in our best interests. They are deceptive, hidden, finding our vulnerabilities and using them against us. Now, if you are being manipulated, then you are no longer free. We're very good at spotting how oppression and authoritarianism diminishes our freedom, those kind of forces from above that push down on our freedom. We're less good at identifying and spotting those forces from kind of underneath, the rug pulled from under our feet. But if you are being manipulated, then you no longer have what Shoshana Zuboff calls the right to sanctuary, this realm, this freedom of thought, this space inside yourself to think for yourself, to be shaped by influences that you actually own and understand. So the biggest threat to our freedom is the core threat to our deepest autonomy. And then to link to neoliberalism, in shorthand, neoliberalism kind of is a model of economics, but then broader than that, what it is to be human and how society should function, based on the idea of us all being very rational, individuals who are just concerned with kind of maximising self-interest, and life becomes a series of transactions, buying and selling, exchange. It is a fiction. It is a dystopia. It doesn't capture what it is to be human, and it ignores and therefore diminishes all of the rest of us, our capacity for love, for care, our vulnerability, our dignity, our rights, our responsibilities towards one another. And when those things are ignored, we lose out on that potential to be fully human.
You've talked about this idea of corporations, and so let's kind of just specifically talk about pornography and the porn industry, and those big companies there, those big tech companies behind a lot of the porn sites have colonised our sexuality. Is this what you're meaning when you talk about that?
Yes, it all connects, and in a way these are all kind of metaphors shining a light on different aspects of what we're dealing with here, which is quite complex, and we're trying to understand what this kind of hydra is and the different heads of the hydra. So yeah, I'm moving between various metaphors, but yes, I would argue that the porn industry has made a land grab for our sexuality. It's terrain, which is where they profit. So the algorithms, the format, the business model. How can we get into your sexuality and then bombard it and craft it towards our corporate interest, towards our corporate profit.
So would you think it's fair to say that in the same way that people are looking at, a company like Meta, and maybe more in the zeitgeist, people are saying, yeah, we're actually starting to critique this now. We're beginning to see that there's some questionable behaviour by this company, or that I maybe don't want to be on Facebook anymore or Instagram anymore because I can see what it's doing for my mental health, or whether people are starting to notice that. Do you think the same critiques could be said of pornography and the same porn? They're using the same tactics, the same methods. It's just it's perhaps not being discussed in quite the same way within broader society yet.
Yes, it's being protected by this notion of sexual freedom, that following your arousal is sexual freedom, which is obviously a complete myth. We are being shaped by the porn industry to develop a sexuality that serves their profit and that takes us away from a sexuality that we would find more fulfilling and that is more ethical. So this is not freedom. And really we need to spear that myth to kind of get somewhere. I'm amazed by how the porn industry has been shielded from the critiques. You've got very big organisations that are brilliant at critiquing the attention economy, and they never ever talk about porn. And yet, I found web pages from major porn companies being very open about surveillance capitalism, about gathering people's data and using it to, in their words, drive better business decisions. They are archetypal surveillance capitalism, gathering people's data without their informed consent and using it to shape them towards their profit, and yet they're not being talked about, and I find it infuriating. So
in what ways are porn users being surveyed by porn sites then?
Well, when you go on a porn site, a free porn platform, again, why is it free? And with any tech service that's free, you are the product, and we're not being taught to think about it like that. But I think of it in a colour code. So green, your sexuality when you first go on a porn site. Red is where you start paying for porn. Between green and red, you are then being moved to the blue and the purple. You might not be paying for porn at those points, but that's your sexuality being shaped by the data that is gathered about you and people like you to determine what content to show you next and how that content looks, that is going to take you down that pathway towards the red where you start paying for porn.
In what way do you feel someone's sexuality can be shaped towards something that's going to create profit for a company?
I mean, what comes to mind there is the words of a young man I heard, that have always stayed with me, where, he was talking about his addiction to porn, and he just said, falling in love with a girl, that's out of the question. I can't imagine that happening. So in a way, that's the short answer. The longer answer, let's return to what I was saying about, our sexuality being like a vine, and what trellis are we going to grow it on? We have the potential to entwine around connection, chemistry, relationship. Porn industry cannot make money from that, ignores it, finds your proclivity to be turned on by other things that are impersonal, that at best are objectifying, at worst are breaking really important taboos, like maybe incest porn, violence, abuse, and then shows you more and more of that content based on data gathered from you and those like you to entrench that arousal pattern and take you down a pathway that can become more and more extreme.
Is there research or evidence around escalation towards more violent or content that maybe a user 6 months earlier would have said, I wouldn't go there, that's not the sort of thing I'd be interested in, and then 6 months later that's what actually they're seeking? Is there research around that?
There is. We're also missing some research, which is because it's difficult to do. Number one, the big tech companies are not sharing data. They're incredibly secretive. So we don't have that, we can't get behind their doors to really look at what's going on in the pathway. They have the answers to these questions, but they're not sharing them with us. So from our vantage point, we have some other kind of research. Certainly, let's take, for example, the research done with men who have viewed child sexual abuse material, talking about their pathway to that. More and more of that research delineating their pathways from more mainstream porn into that content. Now, that doesn't remove their responsibility from viewing that at all, but it's, it fueled that pathway. They went down that avenue into more extreme and abusive content. You also have the research surveying, for example, a big piece of research surveying men online based in the UK, the US and Australia, looking at their sexual behaviour and what they're doing online, and you're finding a really strong link between porn use and sexual offending. So, there's a lot of research that by itself, you could say that's not the full picture, but when you put it together, you triangulate, like they converge to this very concerning picture.
And have you heard in maybe less so in terms of research, but even just in kind of anecdotal stories or conversations, interviews with young people, for example, have you seen that being talked about as well, where young people are saying, actually I can sense that either I'm being shaped or the other people in my school, their sexuality or how they view sex and relationships is being shaped by pornography?
Yes, absolutely. And I think what I find really, tragic and sad is that when I first started working, before big tech had really got going, things felt like they were very much moving in the right direction. So there's a real sadness I hold that, we were making progress. You had feminism kind of on the up. You had this societal consensus around equality. And actually what's happened is that a lot of that's been undone, and a positive trajectory has now become a negative one, to the point where it's not controversial to describe it as an epidemic of sexual abuse and harassment in schools today. I was doing some interviews with teenage girls who had experienced abuse by a male peer, looking at what they felt played a part. Obviously, porn came up. again, some of their words just stay with you. There was one girl I was talking to that just said, there's no point even trying to tell a boy that I'm not an object because they just don't get it. And that's not just the boys that have harmed me, it's just boys in general in her school. Again, I should caveat that I'm not saying that is all teenage boys today at all. It's absolutely not. But sadly, they are being bombarded with content that is encouraging them to objectify, with all the harms that ensue from that.
And I guess it's worth saying as well, even when we talk about, abusive behaviour in a school, that may be about words, verbal abuse, as well as maybe something physical, and I think perhaps that's part of it, isn't it? That there's what young people are saying to each other.
Such a good point to broaden what we're talking about here beyond physical behaviour. And I would even go further than the verbal comments directly to a girl. It's kind of like navigating this whole sea. Again, if I think about another girl who I was talking to said, she was on the bus and she just heard these boys that looked like they were in year 7, so age 11 or 12, watching porn and describing what they would want to do to a girl in their class, which was a kind of gang rape. And that was how they were describing how they fancied a girl now. So for that girl listening to that, that's really harmful. And for the boys who have been taught that that's how you express interest in a girl, that's also really harmful. Both boys and girls are being undermined and compromised, held back from being fully human, from enjoying that self-worth and that connection with one another.
So you talk about being fully human. Obviously that's your project is called that too. And do you feel therefore that then humans do share some sort of core universal values, and what are they, and how do they compare with the values in pornography?
Yes, again, as you know, I love research and delving into it. And again, there's a really rich body of research looking at our values. How do I sum this up pithily? Showing that the majority of us hold these, they've been variously described as intrinsic, compassionate or core values. But, these kind of values around the inherent worth and dignity of one another, and the desire to care and respect each other and look after one another. And what's really interesting with that research is that when you look at children and young people, they kind of start off, holding these values and thinking that those around them hold them. And as they go through the teenage years in our society, a gap starts to emerge between, yes, I believe these things, but I don't really think that many other people believe these things. So they are learning somehow that other people don't hold these values to the degree that they do. And I would argue that's because of the society that we live in, that says that we're all about wealth and status and fame. And so that's really giving the message that other people don't put credence, when actually they do. But if we don't think that other people value compassion in the way that we do, then we're likely to ignore that part of ourselves and not be as visible with it. So there's a big piece of work to be done around telling each other that we do care about this stuff, and that's what we all want to prioritise together, and push back against these forces telling us not to.
I'm trying to just think about, for example, some of the things that, Andrew Tate, famously, self-proclaimed misogynist, but in terms of what he would say and would talk about, he would say, you will be criticised for, he would say to his followers, you will be criticised for talking like this or thinking like this, and you will be told that, you're being kind of, you're being shut down for having the views that I'm telling you should have. Or, I know it's not as simplistic as that, it's more manipulative than that, but that in effect is what's happening. So that when a teacher or a parent might say to a young boy who's following Andrew Tate, how can you say that? That's not what we believe. That's not a value that we hold as humans or as a family. Their response would be, I was told that you would say that. And you're trying to manipulate me into kind of, thinking the way that you think rather than being independent in my thinking. What would you say about that? There's these, you don't necessarily have to talk about Andrew Tate specifically, but it feels like there is this almost next level of manipulation that's happening, that's almost trying to anticipate a call to a core value and question even that, if that makes sense.
I love the way you've summed that up, Ian. Yeah, that's exactly it, that kind of next level of manipulation. And it is classic of grooming and of manipulation to accuse your opponent of what you yourself are, most guilty of. And it's a real bamboozle. And we are in the age of bamboozle, and the age of these kind of mirror worlds where, people have been tricked and manipulated into seeing the world through this kind of upside down lens. So how do we then deal with that? And this comes back to a little bit of what we were saying around, we're good at identifying oppression, but less good at identifying manipulation. In a way, Tate is saying, watch out for those that will curtail you. Your freedom of speech is under threat. Watch out for that oppression. All the while, where he is doing that underneath, manipulation. And so, what would I advise in this situation? Well, rather than just saying, no, you don't think like that, it's to invite young people to think about, okay, well, but what do you think? And really helping them think about, what are your core values? Do they align with Tate? Or do they go deeper than that? And then do you have the courage to act on them and to think for yourself, to think independently of what this very dominant and charismatic person is saying. And then let's also take what Tate says and really examine that. And I think one of the key quotes for me from Tate is his exhortation to his followers: you want 60% likes and 40% hate. Let's look at that, because for me that is critical to understanding Tate. He is a product of the manipulation-based algorithms. Why do we know who Tate is? It's because he was very good, like many other hatefluencers, at gaming the algorithm. The algorithm wants as much hate and outrage and debate, and he played to that. So, after a while, you don't even know who these individuals are. You have their persona that has been created by the algorithm. Who Tate is underneath that, no one really knows.
What do you mean by a manipulation algorithm?
Essentially, I have coined this term to replace the more often used term engagement-based algorithm, because I feel like engagement-based sounds quite innocuous. Engagement, surely that's more of what interests me and more of the content that I like, the people I care about. It's a misnomer, because actually it's not all of those things. It's what Tristan Harris describes as race to the bottom of the brainstem. It's what will trigger me. So the other term I sometimes use is trigger-based algorithms or impulse-based algorithms. What will hook me, which might be my anger, my outrage, or my feelings of superiority, entitlement, or my sexual arousal. It's the algorithm is designed to find those things that will hook me on in a way that I don't quite understand. My vulnerabilities are being exploited and used against me, which is the heart of what manipulation is. So I would argue that we need to be describing them as manipulation-based versus engagement-based, because engagement-based hides the harm, hides the true nature of what is going on.
And in what way do you think, therefore, pornography is using the same tactic as Tate, or perhaps he's using the same tactic as the porn industry has, but causing young people to question these core values, and how do you see pornography, I guess, almost impacting those core values?
Yes, I think there's a number of similarities. that both Tate and the porn industry are encouraging an objectified view of girls and women. And, you know, as we discussed, the impact that objectification has on our psychology, has on the way that we treat one another, that is such a compromise of our core values. Because if I start seeing you as less than fully human, you know, you're not as moral as me, you're not as competent, you're not as intelligent, then I'm less inclined to reach out to you with a core care, compassion, respect, generosity, all of those things that make the world go round. So in that sense, they're very linked. And again, it also comes back to money. Let's keep that always as part of the picture, that Tate's model has been very lucrative for him. The porn industry's model has been very lucrative for it. You know, it's pushing values that make it money. He's pushing values that make him money. And so in answer to the question, you know, the young person goes, yeah, but I'll be told you think that. Who serves to benefit and how do they benefit? Let's just always come back to that.
So when we're in a school, Naked Truth, we all talk about how pornography is like the junk food or the fast food of healthy sex and relationships. You talk about what good sex or healthy relationships look like. What is that? What do you think is the alternative to how porn portrays sex and relationships? What's good sex? What's good relationship?
Yes, and it's also, in a way, the answer to that is also an answer to consent culture. You know, if we are going to move beyond just consent, what are we moving towards? And for me, I don't think this has to be complicated. We all inherently know this, actually, and lots of academics have been talking about it, which is really encouraging. So maybe just a few key bullet points. Mutual and interactive desire. You know, so one person's pleasure and feelings are playing into the others. It's not just about following one's own personal gratification using another person's body. It's how do you feel that affects how I feel in a positive spiral. That's got to be part of the picture. Then also linking to that communication, attunement. In sexual experiences, that communication doesn't tend to be verbal, and that's important. The consent model is often privileging this kind of verbal communication that isn't actually how people generally sexually relate. So it's that attention to that bodily attunement and communication with one another. Then I think underpinning that is this core respect, care. I'm concerned with your best interests as well as my own. And it is always this two-hand approach. I'm thinking about you and I'm thinking about me. And also when I say about attunement, not just attuning to the other person, but attuning to oneself. For that all to work well, I would argue that there needs to be a broad equality between the people. And if you introduce something like money, that just compromises that equality, as well as other kind of power dynamics. That just makes it harder to communicate. It makes it harder for somebody to listen to themselves and to listen to a no within them. And also it's underpinned by an honesty, that there needs to be an honesty between the two people about what their intentions are, about who they are. So I would say, you know, there's a few things there, but they're not complicated. We all kind of get them. They're key things that we would apply in other parts of our life. So let's just bring them into the bedroom where they most supremely belong.
Yeah. As we start to come to a close, I know that you both fully human, Naked Truth, we both have a kind of similar goals, and part of our goals would be to try and change societal attitudes towards pornography, just so that it is seen as a harmful thing, or maybe even an undesirable thing for people. What do you think, for you, what's the next step towards that goal of porn being seen as harmful, for example, or undesirable for people? Is it regulation, education, maybe something else, all of the above? What are you hoping for?
Let's throw everything at this problem. So I think it is very much all of the above. I'm encouraged that the porn industry for far too long has been given this free pass compared to the rest of big tech. Within the UK, at least, that seems to be coming to an end. We've got the recommendations of the recent Baroness Burton-led pornography review, and they're a really good starting point. A core one there is to make illegal online what is already effectively illegal offline. So that would be certain forms of violent porn, she has also recommended a ban on non-fatal strangulation being shown in porn, choking that is, as well as incest porn. So it would help to rid the porn industry of some of its most ugly aspects. In tandem with that, we've also got the Online Safety Act mandating effective age verification. That aspect of the Online Safety Act is coming into play in July of this year. It's kind of watch and see like what's going to happen there, how robustly is Ofcom going to implement that. I'm obviously hoping for very robust implementation, and that it's not just the big free porn platforms, it's across the board. It must include social media, because social media platforms are now porn platforms as well. Also, hand in hand with that, we need to have a ban on manipulation-based algorithms, particularly towards children, and dovetailing with that, a ban on sexualized content being being promoted to children, being shown to children. I would actually add adults into that as well. If we think about, say, indecent exposure laws, it's against the law to indecently expose yourself to another person. Well, how is that different from an algorithm promoting porn to you that you haven't searched for, that you don't want to see, that you didn't intend to see? It looks very similar to me.
Very interesting. How would you go about banning a manipulation algorithm?
Well, obviously there'd be a bit of technical insight needed, but the algorithm designed to promote your engagement above other things, other parts of who you are, above your intentions. So when you look at algorithms, they divide into different groups. Social media can be run on something called a network-based algorithm. So what you see is about who you follow, who you're connected to. So take something like LinkedIn, that is much more network-based. It's kind of on a continuum. So what we need to do is we need to see the platform's algorithms, and we need to see how engagement-based they are and move them away from that to be more network-based, to be more intention-based. So they're showing people what people have said they want to see and what is actually about the people that they connect with, the news that they intend to read, etc.
And we've sort of asked everybody we've spoken to this question. You can fast forward 10, 20 years' time. How would you like society to look in terms of this issue of pornography?
A few things. I would like a really robust regulatory framework, so it's not just given this free pass. It's not just this wild west like we have at the moment. I mean, I'm never going to stop being shocked at the current status quo until it changes. It is jaw-dropping that things, that abuses, that so much of society, that we all are against, or most of us, and so much of society is engaged in a fight against. A young person, a child, can just see within a click online being glorified, being promoted. It's just jaw-dropping. So, porn needs to be cleaned up. It needs to be very effectively age-gated. We need to get rid of those those manipulation-based algorithms. But also, more widely than that, we need that societal shift. We need that awareness, that understanding of what pornography actually is, what it's governed by, what it's driven by, and spearing those myths about sexual freedom, and also some of the myths around ethical porn as well, actually, that much greater critical awareness. And ultimately, I love how Gail Dines summed this up, that children and young people, we all have the right to author a sexuality that is rooted in respect, chemistry and connection. I would love us to be very clear on that right, and to have taken steps to safeguard our sexuality from those forces that would seek to shape it away from our core best interests.
Elly, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for all the work you're doing in this field and the impact you're having. Really appreciate everything that you're doing. So thanks a lot.
Well, it's a team effort, and I'm very pleased to be in it with yourselves. Thank you.